Here's a bit of fern that I'm planning to draw. I don't want to do this whole thing because it's rather large, and most of the items in my drawings are more or less life-sized and relative to each other. So I don't want this to be taking up all the space, and so I'm going to probably going to draw it curved a little bit like this to aesthetically meld a little bit better with everything else in my drawing, as well as maybe cut it off right there. And I might add some little fiddleheads as well. But this is an example of one in which I do have the actual thing to use as a reference. And there you can see there is curvature to it. I'm just going to be accentuating it in a way that is more aesthetically pleasing and melds in with my drawing. This is neat. There's a little bit of a curly Q at the tip. This is one of the things I love about doing botanical art and illustration, is that I start to see and observe things, little details about plants that I otherwise would just overlook and gloss over when I'm just viewing it normally. One of the things you'll notice here that I do, because I'm working direct with my pen and I'm not using pencil. Well, first of all, this is kind of a skill that you develop if you want to be able to just draw with confidence and not do a pencil sketch first. And I do want to add that this is not how I always work. When I'm working with pieces that require a lot of compositional development, then I most definitely do pencil sketching first. And I work with a lot of thumbnail sketches and drawings, and I will do digital mock-ups where I actually do my sketching on the computer, which makes for even easier erasing than with a actual graphite piece of lead. But when I'm doing something like this, where they are mostly independent components, I mean, you saw in the earlier part of the video where I showed you the digital collection of everything, but more or less the individual components, the plants and the critters and everything else, they're all drawn independently. So they may have their own internal flow, and there might be some kind of consistency that moves across the pieces, and they're all going to be displayed in the same framework. But as far as a larger composition complexity goes, there isn't much of that. And so it does leave me a little bit more free to play around with the individual compositions. And in that scope, it's fairly easy to deal with on this level, where I don't have to do a large-scale pencil drawing beforehand to figure everything out. If you followed my Inktober escapades in 2018 and you saw what I did with that, those were a little bit more complicated as far as composition went, because there was composition. There were varied elements in the drawings that I did. There were foregrounds, there were backgrounds, there were main characters and secondary characters. And so that was a little bit more complex. Although, because they were done at a pretty small size, they were done at about 4 by 6 inches, I think, it still was a contained enough scope for me to be able to approach the whole project in this way, where I was just doing direct inking without any sort of pre-drawn pencil sketches. I have to say, though, that even though it's a skill that I've been developing for myself for a while, this confidence to be able to just draw with ink without doing a sketch first, while it is something that I've been doing for a while, I have to say that doing the 30 days of the Inktober in that fashion really honed it even more. I've done compositions like I'm doing with these plants and critters and things for this project, this poster project currently. I've done this before, and I've always sketched out my things, my components beforehand. This project, I'm a little bit more loose with it because the person I'm working with is mostly allowing me to have my own artistic lead on this. I mean, he's got some initial input, but for the most part, he's pretty happy with everything that I've churned out. And so, if you're working with an art director, then it's also less of a feasible thing to be just going directly to your ink permanent lines before showing them every step of the way. So I do have that freedom with this also. But if you're working on just your own project and your own little thing, then again, it's not going to be something that you have to worry about pleasing an art director. I got really sidetracked in what I was saying. What I originally meant to start talking about here with this was way back when I was first putting down the first lines, that you'll notice that I didn't actually start at the very tip of the plant. Well, I did do like the main spine, and I did that little curly tip here, but then I immediately moved on to these sections over here, this stuff. And I want to explain about why I did that, why I sort of jump around in what I was working on and where my eye first lands. My eye and my pen first lands when I start a portion of this, is that because I am working direct with ink, I have to make sure that the parts that are the furthest in the foreground, or the parts that have any sort of overlapping section, I have to approach those first, because those help, defining those areas first helps me to maintain the correct bits of overlaid areas. I don't want to draw the lines that go under and then realize, oh, I needed to have something on top afterwards. And even in other areas, to a lesser extent, I'm still doing that. You'll notice as I did each of these leaves, I always did this little folded over section first, even if it wasn't the most obvious starting point. Well, actually over here, what I'm starting with is I start with the base where it connects up with everything else so that I know how that is approached. And then I make sure that I define all those overlap bits. And that's generally what you have to keep in mind as you work in this method, this way of just going for it. It's, in a way, you have to really think about your composition and the placement of everything that much more, because you're doing it without any chance to redo it because it's in this permanent medium. And so you have to be careful. You have to think about each line. You have to think about where the bits and pieces interact and overlap. And it makes you a bit more conscious about your subject matter. So I like doing this because it makes me, it really pulls me in to what I'm doing and pulls me into the subject matter and makes me pay attention to all those little things that you sometimes might gloss over because you're just scribbling quickly with a pencil. And you can't do that sketchiness that you do with pencil either, where you go like trying to search and find where your lines are. You just have to go for it and know that this is a line and commit to it. But that commitment shows then in the final drawing, and I think that people see this confidence in your strokes. See, I'm taking now little bits and pieces from here. I'm not sticking to any specific section of this. You'll notice what I've done instead is I've followed the general structure of it. The arc, the curve of this main stem, the shape of the leaves and the details of them, and the sizing of them, and the little details of how they connect up to the stem, the way there's a little bit of a bump at the top, and how each successive leaf overlaps the previous one by a tiny bit on the underside. All these little details are important to convey the sense of the thing that you have drawn, because all these little details make up the entirety of it and differentiate it from any other random leaf that you pick up in the forest floor.